I'll call us to order. If you can call roll for us, please.
Ms. Hendricks?
Here.
Mr. Keeley?
Here.
Representing the Director of Finance, Ms. Lee? Chairperson Dillon, you have a quorum.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. So our first and only action item, well, we have a consent. This is it. We'll put 1 and 2 together, the approval of the committee agenda and the minutes from our last meeting. And entertain a motion to approve.
So moved.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any, all opposed, say nay. I'm having a hard time getting into this morning. And any abstentions? All right, we've approved our agenda and our minutes from our last meeting. So we'll kick right into our informational stuff. Melissa, I'll let you tee it off.
Okay, good morning, everyone. So this item, this presentation serves as an education session and really continues your discussion on being succession ready in the event a vacancy occurs for the CEO or the CIO position. The presentation is going to inform you on steps that you've already taken to support succession readiness for the CEO and CIO, including establishing executive search firm services, also the establishment of a chief operating officer and a deputy chief investment officer within the organization. These are key positions that support ongoing continuity of business due to the absence of a CEO or a CIO. Updating the CEO and CIO position descriptions, which Amy and I will cover after this presentation, and also provide insight to you on those pay considerations you should be thinking about for a new CEO or CIO when the time comes. Amy McDuffie, your board governance consultant, and Luis Navas, your primary compensation strategist, are here to walk you through the compensation strategies for you to consider. And with that, I will hand it over to Luis, who is going to kick off the presentation.
Or yeah, we're just waiting for a slide clicker.
Hey, Luis, hit your button. Oh, got it. Good.
Oh, sorry. We're just waiting for a slide clicker. Do you want to maybe talk to?
Sure. So in order to maximize the time while we wait, I think can I just go into some of the background if that's all right with you?
Perfect.
And it's a pleasure to be here this morning. So thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. I think it's always nice when we can start with an education topic, especially with a practice like succession planning that's incredibly important and houses a number of different elements. And more topics that the board is discussing are requiring different veins of consulting expertise to support you in those. And this is a perfect example of that. We started in a very long runway, I would say, for succession planning, which is the best practice to do. You want to do succession planning when you don't have a transition underway. So this is really a good slide that shows you the depth with which the full board and now the committee has been considering succession planning here at CalSTRS. And so I thought what I would do is just recap some of the salient points around what the process has looked like. And the reason I'm focusing on the process so much is, of course, because as fiduciaries, the process is what's important, and having a prudent approach to examining these issues and examining your key risks is really what we want to try to set up for the board so that you can get comfortable both at the full board level and the committee and have aligned expectations around how various issues that are typically arise within transitions would be carried out. So we started way back in fall of 2017. If you can think back to then, we had a couple of different experts come and present both at the offsite and then at the board governance committee talking about traits and characteristics of effective CEOs. And also we had organizational culture that was on the radar screen back then. We moved into a process by which the board started more careful succession planning discussions based on the development of a future vision, the refreshment of a future vision. Now, later on in the board meeting today, we'll also be looking at the strategic plan. That's an item that's before the board today. And we took the opportunity to couple both the succession planning processes and strategic planning processes together so that the one element they share is the development of the future vision of the organization over the long term. And so we leveraged that. We did that in spring of 2018, now almost a year ago. At the same time, there were a couple of different activities that informed the board's discussions. There was a leadership style assessment, if you will, for Jack and Chris at that time. There was a very thorough analysis done of the organizational culture and how that relates to the core values that are expressed. These are all things, again, that flow into how the future looks here at CalSTRS relative to these highest level positions that report to the board. And then, of course, we ended that point in time with the discussion of the future attributes for both of these positions, the CEO and CIO. We did some information and follow-up with the board back in fall, and now we're at the point where we're ready to update the governance documentation. And those two items would be the position descriptions, which Melissa and I will walk you through next. And then in May, at the Board Governance Committee meeting, we'd be looking at bringing a succession planning policy to the committee for your first review and consideration. And so really we're at the tail end of what we would traditionally see as best practices in succession planning from a governance standpoint. But the nice pivot point that we're at is now flowing into compensation related issues with respect to succession. And so that's why we're both here today, as well as Melissa, to make that pivot and do so in a way that, again, starts with education and then leads you into an examination of what are the important issues for your consideration as you move forward. If we could go forward one slide. And you see there's a nice intersection here because the other area of exploration that the board is about to embark on through this committee is to refresh your compensation philosophy and program. And certainly looking at compensation-related matters as it relates to succession planning and how do you best address that during transitions is right at the heart of both addressing your remaining succession readiness topics as well as embarking on this new exploration of the compensation philosophy and program. And so that's why, again, you see us both here, and we're happy to take questions about that. But Luis is going to present really the heart of what considerations are. We have Melissa talking today about what the current package looks like and how those are formulated. And I know, Luis, you have a number of considerations that you think would percolate to the top level mindset of the committee. Perfect. So with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Amy. So again, this is purely educational. In terms of the transition, there's no recommendations here in today's presentation. It's more kind of back and forth and Q&A, et cetera. So in terms of as you're going through this process, one of the things that you'll be, if not already going through, is kind of what the board's expectations are around the future candidates. And a big part of that, regardless of looking at internal candidates or external candidates, is what is the strategy for an organization? There are organizations that might be in a position where they're trying to make a dramatic shift in a strategy, and therefore that might require a different type of individual. There are organizations that quite like the direction they're going in and kind of see status quo. Those are always, tend to be the easier transitions. And then there's kind of, potentially the kind of hybrid situation where they're seeing some kind of a tweak to the strategy, but not a dramatic. And I probably would say that you're in that latter stage. And so some of the things that you'll be thinking about as you go through this process around the transition for the CEO and CIO position is such things as what direction are you going to go potentially under the collaborative investing model that may or may not require a different type of skill set. I think CalSTRS has definitely shown to be a leader in itself around industry leadership and stakeholder leadership. Those will be things that you'll need to think about as you transition, or whether or not that will continue to be important to you. But again, I think the key thing is, you don't kind of start with your comp strategy. You really start with what is our organizational strategy, and then from that, what are the skill sets that we require in these positions to fulfill that strategy.
Hey, Louise, I just want to mention, just for the board, if you prefer Chris and I not to be here for any reason, we can step out. But we didn't, we always want to be vigilant about Government Code 1090. And we asked Brian, and since you're not setting our salaries today or getting that kind of input, there doesn't seem to be a legal issue. But if there's anyone would like us to be out, we'll step out too, so you can have that conversation without us.
Sure.
So Louise, you might be answering this, but one of the questions I'm always thinking about is organizations change, over time, given all sorts of dynamics. And one of the things I'm hoping we can get to, even with succession planning too, is figuring out sort of what do we need at the time that we're in, given whenever the transitions happen or whenever succession happens. And so I wonder, and maybe, Amy, this is more for you too, is just how do you think about when we set policies, which seem to be, I know we change them, but they can be somewhat static over time. How do we think about compensation and some of these questions when, I don't know, there's so much change that's going on. And as I think about what could happen next year versus in 3 years and what we're going to be dealing with and what kind of leaders we might need at those times, how do we make sure, I guess my question is how do we make sure that we're being flexible in terms of compensation? Because that's what we're talking about right now.
Right.
But also just, getting the right leader at the right time for what the organization needs. So maybe that's just a bigger philosophical question, but.
You take the.
I'll take the strategy side, or the organizational strategy side. I think, you're looking at what leaders are needed. I mean, certainly you have a potential difference in models, right? You have a collaborative model that you're looking at from an investment standpoint, and I would encourage you to think about what kind of leaders could best support that? Do you need someone who is a builder and can bring new things to life and create a new direction and see it before it's actually in front of them and provide that kind of leadership? Do you need someone who is more administering what already exists today? There's, from a leadership perspective, I think there's a real difference between a builder and the direction to build and develop and create. Those are two distinct different types of styles, and there's not a right or wrong. Both work in different circumstances and situations. And so I try to encourage you to think about that highest level philosophy and what you're about to embark on. Luis?
Yeah, and from a comp perspective, you've always done things not on a 12-month basis anyway. You've always, set out performance goals and to couple along your strategy to be more long-term thinking regardless. And so I don't see you changing that. I think the continuation of where the current CEO and CIO scorecards and the strategy behind it, it's always kind of, multi-year. And I certainly would never recommend you moving away from that to just, think of short term. So kind of incorporating compensation performance measures, and we're actually going to talk a little bit about that in the slides, that are always, thinking more long term, making sure that your rewards are aligned to longer term performance, not shorter term performance, will help you kind of deal with those moments where you have to pivot and shift. The truth is, nothing ever goes smoothly. It's just the way it is. But have the ability and the flexibility in your compensation plans to pivot and shift, I think, is important, and you've got those tools. So, yeah. So the next is Melissa's going to take the next section here.
So let's go over the offerings that are in your current compensation policy and administrative procedures that support the policy. Louise, you referred to this as the Boards Toolkit, right? And so when you think about the tools you have in that toolkit, we'll go over those together. The first two are base salary and incentive pay, and so that is really reflective of total cash, and that should be anchored to your board-approved comparator group. which you have established for executive management and investment management positions. Two different comparator groups. For the executive position, which would be your CEO, you have a 67% weighting toward public funds, and then a 33% weighting toward private sector. For your investment management position, in this case CIO, you have a blend of leading institutional investors and private sector. The next item there is educational incentive pay, which is available for your investment classifications. So your CIO is eligible for 5% of monthly base pay for completion of certification in an approved program, such as Chartered Financial Analyst. And this is really reflective of continuous learning and the value add that investment professionals bring when they hold one of these certifications. The next is Yes.
So right now that's for investment classifications only?
Correct.
Was on, but it didn't go on. There we go. So that's for investment classifications only. But Jack, I'm asking you, there are other positions within the organization in which other classifications are encouraged, correct? I mean, would that be in accounting? Are there...
Encouraged for the educational?
So we're giving an educational incentive to investment personnel that tried for advanced certification or
For certain
anything like
ones,
that.
yeah, that are designated.
There are other sort of advanced certifications in other areas of our staff, isn't there?
There are that we pay for the certification process, but they wouldn't get a 5% bump in their base salary like the investment staff would.
So do investment.
Is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah, we are looking, but are we thinking about one other area? I thought we were looking at
Yeah.
the financial area.
Yes, for example, in our financial services branch, there are accounting professionals where there's opportunities to provide an educational incentive, and we would have to work with Cal HR on that.
Okay, thank you. That might be something for our work plan or something like that. I just thought- just sprung into my head for that. Thanks.
You know, I think it's worth mentioning also, Melissa, on the defined benefit plan eligibility for our successors, for Chris and I, they are going to be subject to the pepper cap. And I don't know if you mentioned that or not, but that is quite a significant difference in the compensation.
Yes, it could apply to your incumbent if, depending on their employment status and their current retirement plan, they could be subject to the newer defined benefit.
The incumbent or the successor?
I'm sorry.
The successor from outside the system.
Yes.
That would absolutely impact the retirement compensation for this position quite a lot. Because right now, Chris's position and mine are really just subject to the IRS limits for the defined benefit plan, like any highly compensated employee. But because of the pepper limitations, that now is a cap set on a cost of living basis. It's probably about 50% of the IRS limit. So it's and we do not offer a retirement option. You know, well, actually for our longer term board members, you remember we talked about this at the very time Pepper came into place, that at some point this would be a problem for highly compensated outside recruitments. And it's not just these two positions, it would affect other investment staff too, and Chris's staff. For that matter, it's an issue that's sitting on the sidelines. At some point, someone's going to have to address that here, whether or not we need a top hat plan of some kind to provide additional compensation. You and I have talked a little bit about that. Yeah, but I just want to flag it. It's a plan of, above the defined benefit plan. Yeah. It does. That does sound a little too highly. Yeah, that's not a good name. You're right.
Yeah,
but that the point being that.
And when when you describe it as that, is that different than what we have for the 451, 415 that we have for highly compensated members of the system? Because there's a cap.
Well, that's the IRS cap that we are subject to.
Right.
That's about twice the level of this pepper cap. So it's a very significant difference.
Right.
I just, right now, this is an amazing benefit, obviously, for these two positions. It loses that luster a bit for our successors, if our successors would be from outside the system.
Right.
If they were, that's a pretty important if.
So Jack, what I guess I was trying to get at is the top half, so whatever plan, we probably need to find another
Well,
name.
401A is what we, if that.
That would be different than what we have for the members of the system, correct? What you're describing is totally different.
Yes.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure I
Although,
understood that.
not to make this too complicated today, that is an issue we want to talk to you about. Because
Absolutely.
this PEPRA impacts the school districts, and right now, we're not offering a retirement product for those school districts as they confront the PEPRA limit too.
Right.
So it does affect our membership in a similar way, small part, very small part.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Right.
Thank
Yep. The next item up is recruitment pay differential, which you have available, and it's up to 60% for the first year of an individual's annual base pay. And we use that to, of course, attract talent, but also to offset loss of compensation by an individual accepting employment here from their previous employer. There is a clawback component with the recruitment differential that if employment ends within 2 years, you have the ability, a mechanism to take a percentage of the recruitment pay differential back. It's a recruitment pay differential up to 60%.
We're often recruiting people that are in bonus structures, and that's the difficulty. If someone is handcuffed at another employer with a bonus structure, if we can't somehow address that loss of bonus, we can't recruit that person.
It's a one-time payment made upon appointment. And Jack, and I'm glad you mentioned that, Jack. You're eligible if you are a current state employee with incentive eligibility. So we're able to, or outside state service, but specifically for individuals that are working for the state. A portion of it, yes. The next item is relocation expense reimbursement. Did you have a question?
This is really more for potentially a future conversation, but I'd like to have the information. How many employees do we have here at CalSTRS?
About 1,154, 1,200, 1,300.
So
I'm looking at
the-
my
the-
personnel officer.
The education incentive available for investment classifications are for continuing education for members of the investment staff. Upon completion of those education courses, they are eligible for an increase in their base pay. Okay, I got that. So then base pay for the remaining 1,200 employees, what percentage of those employees approximately receive pay increases based upon collective bargaining agreements?
As pay differentials or general salary
Their
increases?
pay goes from $1 to $1.10. Pay increases on their base pay.
I think he's talking about general.
General
General
salary increases?
salary increases.
It's dependent on what's bargained. So for this,
But what percentage of the 1,200 are only getting pay increases based upon collective bargaining agreements?
I think it'd probably be about 80%.
yeah,
80% of them?
the majority, yes.
Okay. And is it possible that their pay increases, I'm not talking about the education incentives, for the 80% of the 1,200 employees that receive pay increases based upon collective bargaining agreements, is it possible that their pay increases in any given year would be more or less than the remaining 20% of employees who get additional pay increases?
No, they haven't.
So
Are
it's
you-
always the same?
No.
A 3% increase goes to 80% of the employees, the other 20% get a 3% increase too?
So for those positions that the board has salary setting authority over, they're not subject to automatic general salary increases.
Okay. I might follow up offline because I don't want to derail this conversation. It's a broader.
I can provide more detail
Yeah,
too
thanks, Melissa.
on the increases we've had over the last few years.
But Harry, I think that's become a topic of conversation amongst several of us. And I think that's maybe what we're thinking about getting into the work plan next year, exploring some of that
Yeah.
I guess
the
just
remainder of the,
those under, just for clarification a little bit, those in the subject to collective bargaining will generally, they will have merit salary increases as they go through their pay structure, but they have general salary increases that are subject to collective bargaining and those pay ranges moving. So they may have 2 salary adjustments in a year. So those staff could be having a higher increase in a year than what our investment staff are because they don't have merit salary. They have the merit salary increases that Jack and Chris will assign, but their pay does not move with the general salary increase if you guys reset it. They decide that once a year.
and when you talk about merit, you're talking about movement in the salary schedule,
Move it
correct?
within a salary range. So if the collective bargaining person subject to collective bargaining may have a merit salary increase, and then the general salary increase might increase that increase for that period of the year.
So
Yeah,
I think
so I-
That
we
might
need to
be,
get
so
a
for
better
instance,
grip on it.
so for
on how that
instance,
all happens.
the salary, the range is adjusted 4% for, subject to the agreements, but merit salary increases were 5%. So in essence, they were receiving a 9% increase if they weren't at the top of their range.
So for a future conversation, at the heart of my thinking on all of this is equity and a belief in equity across compensation regardless of title or position in an organization. And it's not appropriate for here, and we can follow up at a separate time.
The only comment I made is, unfortunately, our comp plan lives in a world of a bifurcated philosophy, one of total discretion based on the statutory positions that you determine and we decide is appropriate for staff, and then one of no discretion because those are set through collective bargaining. And trying to get those aligned is the challenge to create equity, because one is discretionary and we can do a lot for the staff in the discretionary system. So that's it.
It's not black and white, I just wanted to make that point. It's not as simple as.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know, I believe I was touching on the relocation expense reimbursement, which provides eligibility for reimbursement for moving or relocating an individual who's accepting employment here at CalSTRS. We touched on those benefits that are offered to employees that are joining the state. Defined benefit is one of them, the pension eligibility, as well as healthcare, which includes dental and vision and disability insurance, retirement and savings. So there is also a savings plus opportunity, 401, 457B, and then a wide variety of leave offerings, annual leave, bereavement leave, personal and holiday leave. So that is the kind of comprehensive compensation package that you have and benefit package for potential successors. We're going to move on now to the current CEO incentive criteria. The CEO is eligible for 0 to 80% of their annual base pay, so it's a max 80% opportunity. And you'll notice for the CEO, the quantitative measures are less than the qualitative measures because of the focus that the board has placed on the long-range strategic performance and also in leading the organization, and also reflects the CEO's not lack of, but not as involved in making those investment decisions as the CIO.
So Sharon, to your point, to your earlier question, if you see, so 70% of the scorecard is actually multi-year, long-term weighted.
And then if we go to the next slide, you will see the qualitative component, and that's your CEO criteria that you annually review together. You prospectively set the CEO's targets and make any adjustments to the criteria. And you did so a couple years ago on this and the CIO. Luis is going to go over in a couple of slides the criteria and what you should consider for the CEO and CIO.
Can I make a?
Yes.
Let me just jump in real quickly on the scorecard of the last slide. Just with 2 quick points. And the first, of course, is we started out by talking about the process that a fiduciary takes, a prudent process. This is a perfect example of the thoughtful deliberation and consistency that has gone into the incentive criteria. Here at CalSTRS, these criteria are longstanding. The board reviews them on a prospective basis. And so again, I think this sends the message that very consistent. There's nothing really arbitrary about this. The other point, though, from a succession planning standpoint that I think is always good to look at is when you look at, what it would take in that bottom 3 or the 3 rating of superior, what it would take to get that level of incentive, if you will, could look very different if you are someone new to the position in your first year. You may want to spend more time internally focused. And so this is the kind of the essence or the crux of part of this conversation is just being aware of what criteria, what incentives, what behavior really are you trying to drive and what's realistic when there are new individuals in that seat.
This slide reflects the current CIO incentive criteria. And for the CIO, you will notice that, of course, the majority of the weighting is to the quantitative measures, which reflects total fund, and the average of asset class scores, which is reflective really of our CIO's direct line of sight and decision-making with investments. The next slide reflects again, just as a CEO, the CIO also has established criteria that is reviewed annually by the board and set as Amy described. And so again, things to think about as far as what you envision for a successor in a CIO role and the focus you want. This would be a tool that you could leverage to make some adjustments.
Thank you, Melissa. So I'm going to take this last section. So as you're going through the transition, you're thinking about will this change at all going forward in that. And I think to Amy and Melissa's point, the good news is the tools that you've been working hard to create. These are flexible tools, the performance scorecards, the plans. They allow you to kind of pivot and shift and kind of put your hands on the levers and help in terms of how much of a lever change you want to make, if at all. So that's I think a positive thing in terms of where you stand around the infrastructure and the tools that you have around you. It's you probably are wondering why we put this slide up first. So I find a lot of times when boards and organizations think about a transition of senior talent, the first thing that is raised is comments like financial returns and strategy. In my experience, and I think my partners here at the table would agree, one of the where people in transition tend to fail or struggle quickly is stakeholder relations. I can't kind of overemphasize the importance of having somebody in the roles, and I think the 2 incumbents today in the roles are prime examples of making sure that with all the stakeholder groups you've got really good relationships. Obviously state, the industry peers, staff, the board relationship is critical. These are all things that anyone who's kind of done it can agree that it's a minefield, is the way I call it. It's very challenging. It takes a very special skill set to go through it, and that'll be something that you think about in terms of evaluating the talent that needs to transition into the roles. Obviously, those other factors such as strategy, investment results will be key criteria, but I would definitely encourage you to not underestimate this skill set as you look through the transition.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something quickly, and it's with respect to the incumbents. And I know in your stakeholder community, constituent groups in particular, and the great deal of outreach that they do. That's something that I think is a value that the board may want to consider and reemphasize if you want to, as part of any transition in the future, because there are executive directors and CIOs across the country that may not be engaged in that kind of active or proactive outreach. And if that's something that has driven success here for CalSTRS, then that's something to consider reemphasizing as part of that transition. So I just wanted to make that point.
Agreed. The other thing mentioned in terms of the qualitative criteria that's really quite important for any organization, you'll see in the two last points there, the inclusion of culture. That's also where I think people tend to not spend enough time on when they think about the transition. They kind of gravitate right away towards the quantitative type factors. But looking at individuals that truly fit your culture, that you're not going to be 12 months into it and say, my God, there's friction between these two individuals in our board. There's friction between these two individuals and our teacher stakeholders. It's really, and again, it's not an easy thing to go through, but getting that gut feeling that, what, I could, I have a client that always says, I like to take anyone I interview, I like to take them to a ball game. If I can spend 2.5 hours with them at a ball game and truly have, good dialogue where I actually want to stay through the entire game with this person, okay. So that's my, again, it's not scientific, et cetera, but it's incredibly important. And again, these are qualitative criteria, assuming if you go back to where I started in the presentation in terms of where an organization is at the point of transition. If it's a situation where you're looking for a complete 360 change of the ship, if it's kind of status quo or it's kind of some tweaking, obviously this will be somewhat different in that, but 90% of it would hold true in any situation. And just want to kind of reinforce that to not undervalue the qualitative criteria. Just some transition considerations. Again, this is not specific to CalSTRS. This is kind of just general industry-wide for the purpose of the education session. But as an organization is going through a transition, it's important to assess, what is the level of compensation opportunity that you're comfortable in offering. You've done a lot of work in terms of over the years in terms of looking at what is the compensation philosophy that you want to follow as an organization for these two positions. But that's going to be important in terms of making sure that before you go into the process of interviewing or considering any candidates, to know within your toolkit, as Melissa walked you through, does that toolkit work? Do the quantitative parameters within the toolkit, the example that Jack spoke to is a good example, is just really understanding kind of what you're able to go out into the marketplace. And coming up in May, obviously, McLaughlin will be coming back to the board and presenting some of the market analysis and that. So you'll get a good kind of feeling for how your philosophy compares to the market. We'll get into also kind of a strategy component to that in a moment. You'll be looking at the experience and qualifications and institutional knowledge of CalSTRS. How that needs to be considered and valued. I think, back to the previous slide, I think you're going to, probably say that that's pretty important to you in terms of that. That will be definitely harder to come by than some of the other factors. And then, we've spoken to this point in the past in terms of internal versus external candidates. What I've raised in the past here is that, and Melissa touched on this in terms of the toolkit, Obviously, if you're looking for, if you end up deciding to, throughout your process, to then go with an external candidate, if he or she is leaving behind a bonus on the table or any type of other type of compensation that you need to buy that out, you're going to end up paying more to recruit that candidate if you decide to transition through an internal candidate. So those are just some things that you'll need to be thinking about, as any organization would be needing to think about. I know that you've already selected 3 executive search firms to include in a pool, but you'll have to think about whether or not you want to use an independent recruiting firm to go through that process. Our view has been with all our clients, and again, for clarity, we do not do search. So there'll be a variety of advisors that you'll use through the process, myself, Amy, others, in terms of providing support through the process. But what Amy spoke to the importance of fiduciary obligation and process. Our recommendation with our clients has always actually been to actually go down a dual path, to say, okay, we've got a great succession planning process internally and looking at internal candidates, et cetera. Even if an organization, in my view, especially a public fund, even if that organization has 100% clarity that they want to go with an internal candidate, we've actually always recommended that you still consider the external path, because you want to be able to, at the end of the process, to be able to look at all your stakeholders in the eyes and say, we have done all our proper due diligence. Nobody can criticize us, or the famous case is the Disney case years ago that they ended up getting sued by their stakeholders for not doing a proper external process in that. So we definitely don't, not saying that could happen here in terms of the any type of litigation. You just want to be able to say, we as a board did met our fiduciary obligations. We looked at all avenues, and then can say with great comfort and confidence that where you landed is the best case. And then lastly, as an organization looks at the transition process, is just looking at the board policies to see if there's any type of adjustments that are required in any type of a transition. So this is where you're not particularly on the external side, you're not going to kind of know. I think you're going to have all the market analysis that comes in from McLaughlin, et cetera, but you're not going to know every little bit of outcome that might happen through the process. You might have either an internal candidate or an external candidate that has an ask that isn't unreasonable. It may not even be compensation related. It may be I'm going on mat leave and I just, I'd like to have 6 weeks, or, things like that. And that's where you'll have to just look at, at that moment, any type of adjustments in board policy that may or may not be required. I guess I kind of just touched on this and that, but again, you won't know this until you're going through the process and you're looking at certain incumbents in that. But are there any type of special one-time recruitment arrangement that you're comfortable with offering that will be required? And again, people always quickly gravitate to monetary issues. In my experience, most of the time it's actually not a monetary issue. It's just something related to a personal issue or a job issue. Sometimes, yes, there are compensation related issues that arise, but an organization just needs to be prepared for that. And again, through the process, if it comes up, you'll have access to either myself or Amy or the recruiter, and you'll just have to be able to either say yes or no, depending on what reflects the policies of CalSTRS and what you feel comfortable supporting or not. Then we touched on the second point really already, but on the last point, this question had come up, I think, in preparing for this presentation. Is is there any any type of changes that will need to be made in the performance scorecards, in the incentive criteria to measure performance. And so I think they're actually on the next slide. Yeah, so we kind of, I'll just kind of go right into it with this slide and that, because it all covers the same issue in that. So, the answer is, it's going to depend. So I personally think in your situation, because this is not a dire situation where you're looking for a change, a dramatic change in leadership and strategy and just moving the ship 360 degrees, that the scorecards that we pulled up earlier that are currently being applied to the current CEO and CIO, I think personally you're probably just going to have some tweaking, and that's a very good position to be in. But the area that I think you probably would have some slightly more change in the first year would be on the qualitative side. And what I mean by that is back to the slide that we talked about, stakeholder relations, and that, whereas the current CEO and CIO, could probably do the stakeholder relations side blindfolded, that individual, even if they're very good at it, I think you're going to want to reinforce, some of those qualitative factors to say, in your first year, we really want you to make sure that, you've developed great relationships with all our teacher relationships, our government relationships, employee relationships. And that, so that would probably be just kind of that first year, 12-month modification to the scorecard. And then you'd probably in second year move more towards what you've been, seeing. And again, that's I think an enviable position to be in versus many organizations that are going through transitions. That's the benefit, I think, of I think the number I gave was 2017 that the process started. So it's the benefit of starting this process earlier rather than later. And then same will happen in terms of the quantitative components, et cetera. But again, the only time that you really see a dramatic shift on the quantitative side is when there's really an organization that's in a very challenging state and needs some dramatic change, and that just in our view is not where this organization is.
So Louise?
Yep.
In having that conversation about the changes in the qualitative, and we have very high expectations of both our CIO and CEO in our qualitative standards. And a lot of that is involvement externally in associations that we're involved in, the stakeholders and things like that. So if we were to change that, so to get a superior score in those areas, you have to be involved in all those things. So what I think I hear you saying is that then maybe that first year we drop how much we expect them to be involved in some of those types of things. So for me, that means that during that first year, and I might not be putting this well, so I'll try to clarify it if you don't understand what I'm asking. So for me, that means that a new candidate that's external, that doesn't have those types of relationships, if we drop that down, is still eligible for their full compensation, say that first year, as opposed to us not changing it. So for me, are we having the philosophy behind it is, do we want somebody that's brand new to be able to achieve that total max incentive, or is that something we want to leave as a goal for them to get to? So I think that's a philosophy change, and I'm wondering if you have an opinion on that. Is there a reason to maintain your higher levels because that's where you want them to go? Or do you make it easier for somebody to attain because they don't have that, and and you're recognizing that?
Okay, good question. So there's a few questions in there that I'll address. So one point is, I'll first start with saying is, you mentioned for external. So to me, this would apply for an internal or an external candidate. I think that, with all due respect, even people that are currently at CalSTRS that could be considered for the position probably don't truly understand how challenging, that stakeholder relations piece is, and how time consuming it is. The way that the tool has been designed, it gives you the ability to achieve everything that you just walk through without having to change the maximums and the splits. So all that we would be seeing is it's not actually a big shift in the philosophy, and it's not a big shift at all in terms of the payouts. It's just how you end up populating the qualitative piece, right? You may, as a board, say, for the first year, we want to actually increase the qualitative to 25 to 35%, but I don't think you necessarily will have to do that. I think it's really going to be more of just changing up what those qualitative measures are in the 25% bucket. Because at the end of the day, we really don't want to start playing around too much with the design of the tool, because we know it's been working quite well, but also we don't want to get them unfocused on the quantitative part. At the end of the day, meeting the pension promise is key. So it's really just kind of taking that 25% bucket and likely for the first year, overemphasizing some new measures that are important to make sure that they're successful in that first year. And again, they're probably going to say, I hear you that this is important, this and that, but you want to put it into the scorecard so that they really focus on those things that you yourself know. In some ways, in different ways, you've lived it in terms of how important that is. So it's really not going to be that complicated of trying to have to change the maxes or anything like that. It's just changing the measures within the qualitative bucket.
Could I just follow up real quickly? Could you back up to the scorecard? Just
I was going to go there, and
I
then
wanted to see just a practical measure, because I think in particular on the leadership category, you look at number 3, in addition to 1 and 2, right? So this is additive. Demonstrates a global reach and the ability to influence many organizations and policymakers. If you're an external candidate coming in as the CEO and let's just say you have no relationships here in California, this is where the nuance is that you have to really, where is the focus going to be first? And I guess maybe that was the question that I heard you ask that, Luis, you could refer to, not necessarily the overall weightings, I get that, but specifically for this scorecard, how does that change?
That's what I was saying. So you won't change the weight, because I thought you were kind of getting towards, do you change the max? Yeah. So you don't have to change. So this is where, again, this is why it's such a great tool. Like, this becomes totally flexible from a year-to-year basis,
Right.
based on where your objectives are in terms of what you want to drive, what behavior do you want to drive. So, like, really what we would probably walk you through with working with Amy and Melissa is to say, and actually the individual is to say, okay, don't change, threshold target superior stays the same. Don't change the weighting in terms of 25%, that stays.
Right.
Don't change the top tiers of the buckets of management, communication, policy matters, et cetera. But you likely will absolutely change the actual measures within those buckets. Right?
Because all the 3s are like a really seasoned CEO. And
Exactly.
Right? That's a.
Yeah.
Exactly.
As
Right.
a seasoned CEO.
And that's kind
they might not
of, that's
have
kind of
that.
what I was trying to get to is, if this is truly where we want them to get, do we change this?
Yep.
I think we would.
Yep. And again, this is something that when we first put this tool in place, whatever it was, 7 years ago, it was really trying to reiterate of having something that every year, as you're, it actually goes back to Sharon's earlier point in the discussion. As things change, as our strategies change, how do we do that? This is one of your tools. It's totally okay to actually, wipe the page blank for a year and say, okay, well, these are these are now your new measures in that.
Took a long time, so let's not wipe it. This took a long time, I remember doing.
Again, not to get ahead of ourselves in that, but you might say, you know what, for this first year, we're actually going to have a 6th silo. Like you might, I don't think you actually need to, because I think you can actually slot in a lot of this around it. But if you were to look back in the last 6 years since we adopted this tool, in terms of the application that's been applied for Jack and Chris, that's exactly what you've done. You've always kind of done some tweaking based on what you would like them to be focused on, rewarded on.
And I think you don't want to penalize someone with less experience, like you don't want to.
Go ahead and click in.
So, sorry. We don't want to sort of, I don't know, stack the deck against a new CEO that doesn't have some of this experience, and sort of you're penalized for not necessarily having some of this experience yet. Do you know what I'm saying?
Right.
I mean, it seems like modifying some of this language, not lowering the bar necessarily, still having a high standard, but
You definitely need to know what's realistic.
Yeah.
And attainable.
Yeah.
Relative to the incentive. And I think this is also a great example of why, typically among other public retirement systems, the old model of succession planning has been wait until a transition or retirement is announced, and then now that's succession planning. You can see why there are so many different structural components and elements to this that I'm really quite impressed with this board's ability and focus to bring this to life in a new and different way that is not like any other process really that other public retirement systems have followed, by looking at some of these structural components in advance, getting aware of them, knowing what might need to be adjusted, and thinking through different scenarios. That's what makes this such a good process.
Agreed. So that actually tied in nicely into the earlier comment that Sharon made, so I thought it was, okay, so that was good.
Glad I could help.
That's a good bridge into our next
Yes.
item too.
So then the very last section is just, some potential next steps that are a bit more specific, are definitely more specific to CalSTRS, but at the same time, these are next steps that normally would be followed in any organization that's more proactively looking at senior level transition. And some of this is already, frankly, in process. So the first one is already in process. In May, our firm will be collaborating with McLaughlin, who will be presenting kind of the market analysis. You've done the market analysis, now a couple of times over the last 4 years. That market analysis will kind of show you, how these positions stack up relative to the compensation philosophy that has been adopted by the board. And that will be information that will be helpful to you in terms of going into and through the transition process. You'll need to consider whether or not you want to review or update the existing compensation philosophy. I think I mentioned in the fall session that it's probably been long enough that the compensation philosophy has not been reviewed. I believe it's actually been about 6 years since the compensation philosophy has not been reviewed. Typically it's reviewed every 3 to 4 years. And I think considering some of the things we'll talk about in a second, such as the collaborative investment strategy, et cetera, it makes it, and plus the transition that's occurring, it's a good time to just go through that exercise. The good news is I don't think it'll be a painful exercise because you've already got a good comp philosophy in place. But just looking through that in terms of, how you want to pay for performance, does the peer group still make sense? All those types of things are a good exercise to go through a transition process. And then looking through the incentive criteria, again, we've already talked about that in the prior 2 slides. That'll be something that you'll obviously look through as you look at to transition. And then it does kind of tie in nicely in terms of the compensation philosophy review, but based on what comes out of that is then looking at what changes, if any, frankly, would be required to the existing compensation policies.